Most people think the Jeffrey Epstein story ended when he died in that Manhattan jail cell in 2019.
Disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein has taken his own life while he was behind bars here in New York City. Epstein was facing sex trafficking charges.
They think the story was about a billionaire, a private island, a list of names that never got entirely released. And they're right about all of that. But there's a chapter of the story that almost no one is talking about. A chapter that didn't start with Jeffrey Epstein. It didn't start in the 1990s or 1980s. It started over 300 years ago. And once you understand what St. Thomas and the Virgin Islands actually are, what they've always been, Epstein's choice of location stops being a coincidence. It starts looking like a deliberate selection. A place chosen because of its history, because of what it was already set up to do. Today we're going to go deep. We're going to start at the beginning, the very beginning, and trace a straight line from the colonial slave trade, through piracy and smuggling routes, through a century of political ambiguity, all the way to Jeffrey Epstein building his compound on Little St. James and calling it his island, because nothing about that choice was random. Let's start 300 years ago. To understand why the Virgin Islands became what they became, you have to go back to the late 1600s. The island of St. James was formally colonized by Denmark in 1672, and almost immediately, the Danish crown understood something about this island that would define it for the next 3 centuries. Its location was perfect. Sitting at the eastern end of the Caribbean chain, St. Thomas sits at one of the most strategically important crossroads in the entire Atlantic world. Ships moving between Europe, Africa, and the Americas all pass through or near this corridor. The Danish crown made St. Thomas a free port, meaning goods, ships, and people could move through it without minimal taxation and minimal scrutiny. This was intentional. Denmark was a smaller colonial power competing against the British, Spanish, French, and Dutch. The way you compete when you can't match military or colonial scale is to make your territory the easiest place to do business. And the most valuable business in the 17th and 18th century Atlantic world was the slave trade. The town of Charlotte-Amalie, which is still the capital of the US Virgin Islands today, became one of the largest slave trading ports in the entire Western Hemisphere. Some historians have estimated that over 100,000 enslaved Africans passed through St. Thomas between 1680 and 1792. Think about that number, 100,000 human beings, bought and sold on a single island, and most of them bound for sugar and tobacco plantations across the Caribbean and the American mainland. But here's what matters for our story. The infrastructure built to move enslaved people, the ships, the networks, the warehouses, the routes, the corrupt officials, the look-alike financial systems, that infrastructure doesn't just disappear when slavery is abolished, it transforms. It finds new cargo. In St. Thomas, it found a lot of different cargoes over the centuries. And this is a key insight that I want you to hold on to for this entire video. Geography doesn't change. Routes don't change. Networks built over generations don't disappear when laws change. They adapt. The same harbor that processed enslaved human beings in the 1700s became a hub for different kinds of illicit movements in the 1800s, the 1900s, and right up to today. The infrastructure remained. Only the commodity changed. Let's talk about what happened when slavery was abolished, because the island didn't slow down. It actually got more complex. When most people think about Caribbean piracy, they think about the early 1700s, the so-called golden age of piracy. Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, that era. But St. Thomas's relationship with piracy was more complicated and more durable than Hollywood would have you believe. Because St. Thomas was a free port. It was also a place where pirates could sell their stolen cargo legally, or at least without much interference. Goods stolen from Spanish ships, British merchants, French vessels, they'd show up in Charlotte-Amalie and be purchased by traders who didn't ask many questions. The Danish colonial administration had a financial incentive to look the other way. Pirate money was real money. Tax revenue from the sale of stolen goods was still tax revenue. But beyond piracy, St. Thomas became a smuggling hub in a more systematic way. The free port status meant that goods that were heavily taxed or outright banned in British or Spanish territories could flow through St. Thomas freely. This includes weapons, it included currency, it included enslaved people, even after various nations began banning the trade. And after abolition, it included another contraband. The 1800s saw St. Thomas become one of the most important neutral trading posts in the world. During the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate ships used the island's harbor. Goods and intelligence passed through St. Thomas, regardless of which side was normally in control. The island was effectively stateless in practice. Danish in name, international in function. Here's a detail I want you to sit with. The Danish colonial government in St. Thomas had a specific legal concept called with-adobe, which essentially meant that the government claimed a portion of the estates of foreigners who died on the island. What this created, in practice, was a bureaucratic system with almost no accountability to any outside nation. People could do business in St. Thomas and disappear into legal ambiguity. Now I want you to notice something. Every single feature I just described, neutrality, limited oversight, free movement of goods and people, legal ambiguity for foreigners, officials with financial incentives to look the other way, every single one of those features would still be present in the US Virgin Islands in 1998 when Jeffrey Epstein started building his compound. The Danish flag was gone, but the architecture remained. Let me bring you forward now to the 20th century, because this is where the story really starts to accelerate. In 1917, the United States purchased the Danish West Indies, what we now call the US Virgin Islands, from Denmark for $25 million in gold. The strategic reason was World War I. The US was worried that Germany might seize Denmark and gain a foothold in the Caribbean. The Virgin Islands, with their prime harbor position, would have given any European power a strategic naval base uncomfortably close to the Panama Canal, so the US bought them. And this created something genuinely unusual in American law, an unincorporated territory. Now, this matters enormously. Pay attention here. An unincorporated US territory is not a state. It's not treated equally under the Constitution. Residents of the US Virgin Islands are US citizens, but they cannot vote in federal elections. They have no voting representation in Congress. Federal oversight and enforcement has historically been more limited, more bureaucratic, and more patchwork than in the 50 states. What this means practically is that the US Virgin Islands occupies a legal gray zone. It's American enough that the US dollar is the currency. American courts technically have jurisdiction, and the American flag flies. But it's different enough that the enforcement of federal law has historically been inconsistent, underfunded, and politically complicated. The FBI field office covering the Virgin Islands has long been understaffed. Federal prosecutors historically have heavier caseloads with fewer resources than mainland counterparts. Local law enforcement and local courts have enormous discretion, and this is without mentioning the economic dynamics of a small island territory where wealthy landowners, especially wealthy foreign landowners, have outsized influence over local politics, local law enforcement, and local judges. Now let's layer on top of this the mid-20th century history, because the 1970s through the 1990s were a particularly important period for the Virgin Islands. Starting in the late 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s, the Virgin Islands became one of the key transit points in the Caribbean drug trade. The cocaine and marijuana pipelines from South America to the United States ran through the Caribbean and the Virgin Islands. With their history of free movement, their understated federal presence, and their network of small cays and private islands were ideal waypoints. DEA operations in the Virgin Islands during the 1980s and early 1990s documented extensive drug trafficking networks operating through St. Thomas, St. Croix, and all the surrounding smaller islands. Boats, planes, private airstrips on private islands, all of it functioning in the same way. The contraband networks had always functioned in this geography. And here's what matters. The people running those networks weren't outsiders who showed up in the Virgin Islands. They were, in many cases, connected to the island's existing power structures. Local business figures, local political figures, and wealthy transplants who had figured out the same thing Jeffrey Epstein would later figure out. If you want to do something that the US government would investigate you for on the mainland, the Virgin Islands is a better operating environment. Jeffrey Epstein purchased Little St. James, a 75-acre private island about a mile off the southeastern coast of St. Thomas, in 1998. He reportedly paid around $7.95 million for it. He then spent tens of millions more building what can only be described as a compound, a main residence, multiple guest house, a private beach, a helipad, a marina, underground tunneling that has been partially documented through legal proceedings, a blue and white striped building that became one of the most recognizable and disturbing structures in any aerial photo of the property. Now, why Little St. James? Why the Virgin Islands? Epstein had money, he had connections, he could have built a compound anywhere in the world. He had properties in Manhattan, in New Mexico, in Paris, in the Palm Beaches. He had options. The answer, I believe, is that Epstein, or whoever advised him, understood exactly what the Virgin Islands were, understood the legal structure, understood the tax structure, understood the oversight gap, understood the history of the place. Let me walk you through the specific advantages that Little St. James offered. First, private island status. A private island is not searchable without a warrant. Law enforcement cannot approach without notice. In the Virgin Islands, the process for obtaining a warrant to approach a private island requires coordination between local VIPD, the FBI San Juan field office, and potentially federal prosecutors. A slow, bureaucratic process that gives enormous advance warning. Second, the territory's legal ambiguity. Because the Virgin Island is a U.S. territory and not a state, certain federal statutes apply differently. Minimum sentencing guidelines, interstate commerce definitions, and the jurisdictional reach of certain federal agencies all work slightly different. Third, the economic relationship between wealthy landowners and local government. Epstein didn't just own the land, he cultivated relationships with local officials. His foundation, Gratitude America, made significant donations to Virgin Island causes. He employed local workers. He was, by all accounts, treated as an important economic presence on the island. In 2008, when Epstein received his sweetheart plea deal in Florida, the notorious agreement that allowed him to serve just 13 months under work release while sex trafficking charges were quietly dropped. The handling of his Virgin Island activities was notably absent from the deal. The deal was structured in a way that appeared to deliberately leave the Virgin Island operations in legal ambiguity. That wasn't an accident. After his 2008 conviction, Epstein returned to Little St. James. He continued operating from there. He was able to do this in part because the very legal architecture that had protected smugglers and traffickers in the Virgin Island for 300 years was still functioning. The legal investigation launched by the Virgin Islands Attorney General's office, which was active between 2020 and 2024, documented how Epstein's operation used the island's specific legal structure. The AG's office sued Deutsche Bank and JP Morgan Chase for knowingly facilitating Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking through financial structures that were routed partially through the Virgin Island entities. JP Morgan settled the lawsuit for $290 million. Deutsche Bank settled for $75 million. These weren't settlements from innocent bystanders. These were settlements from institutions that knew what they were facilitating. I want to zoom out again because Epstein's island doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in the context of a regional geography that has been a trafficking corridor for decades. The US Virgin Islands sits between Puerto Rico to the west and the British Virgin Islands to the east. The BVI, British territory, different legal system, banking secrecy rules, is literally minutes away by boat. You can be in international waters in under 10 minutes from Little St. James. You can be in BVI waters in under 20. The corridor between St. Thomas, the BVI, and the Eastern Caribbean has been documented by law enforcement and international anti-trafficking organizations as one of the most active human trafficking routes into the United States. The U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Person report has noted the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as key transit and destination points for trafficking victims moving into the continental United States for decades. The combination of maritime access, limited enforcement, and proximity to both U.S. jurisdiction and international waters creates exactly the conditions that traffickers look for. Here's what I want you to understand. When Epstein built on Little St. James, he wasn't choosing a random beautiful island in the Caribbean. He was planting himself at the center of a pre-existing network. A network that had been operating in that geography for generations. He didn't build the infrastructure, he used the infrastructure that was already there. The routes, the local officials who knew how to be accommodating, the legal structure, the president of wealthy foreign landowners operating with minimal scrutiny, the maritime access, the proximity to international waters. He found a place that was already designed, through 300 years of history, to facilitate exactly what he wanted to facilitate. And this is why exposure of Jeffrey Epstein's operation was so threatening to so many powerful people. Because it wasn't just about one man, it was about an entire system. A system with 300 years of roots. Let's talk about what the investigations since 2019 have actually established. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in December 2021 on federal trafficking and conspiracy charges. She is currently serving a 20-year federal prison sentence. Her conviction established, legally, that the operation Epstein ran was real, organized, and involved the trafficking of minors. The Virgin Islands Attorney General's civil litigation, which ran through 2023 and 2024, established through documented discovery and sworn testimony that Epstein's U.S. Virgin Island operation was financially sophisticated, that he used local entities and local tax benefits to structure his finances, and that major financial institutions had reasons to know what he was doing and continued to serve his accounts anyway. The flight logs from Epstein's private planes, while partially released and partially contested, documented the movement of individuals to and from the island over a period of more than 15 years. What the investigations have not fully revealed, and this is important to be honest about, is the complete picture of who was on that island, and what specifically occurred, and how far up the web of complicity actually went. The so-called client list has never been fully released. Dozens of names mentioned in the depositions and court documents remain redacted. Several individuals who were deposed under oath invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination repeatedly. I'm not going to be specific about the names. That's not what this video is about. What this video is about is the place, the system, the 300-year history that made that place what it is. The people will be accounted for by the legal system, at whatever pace and to whatever extent the system is willing to do its job. What I can tell you is this. Little St. James was not chosen at random, and the operation that ran from Little St. James was not something that one eccentric billionaire invented from scratch. It was something that plugged into a system that had been running in that geography since before the United States existed. I want to end this video with something that I think is important. The people of the US Virgin Islands are not complicit in what happened on that island. The vast majority of the 100,000 people who live in the territory had nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein or with the networks that use their homes as an operating ground. The history I've described, the slave trade, the piracy, the smuggling routes, the drug trafficking, that history was done to the Virgin Islands as much as it was done from the Virgin Islands. The people of this territory were themselves trafficked, exploited, and subjected to 300 years of extraction by outside powers. What this history exposes is not a culture. It exposes a geography that powerful outside actors, colonial governments, slave traders, pirates, drug traffickers, and ultimately Jeffrey Epstein recognized and exploited for their own purposes. The real lesson of Little St. James is about power and legal structure, about what happens when territory exists in a gray zone, American enough to offer protection, different enough to escape full oversight, about how networks of exploitation don't get dismantled when laws change. They adapt. They find new forms, they find new operators, until someone decides to actually follow the full trail, all the way back, 300 years back. Epstein's story isn't over. The investigations that name major financial institutions, JP Morgan, Dutch Bank, as knowing facilitators have barely scratched the surface of who knew what. Congressional inquiries have been blocked or stalled. Key documents remain sealed. But understanding the history, the real, documented, century-long history of this geography, that's how you start to understand the scale of what we're actually looking at. Not one man, not one island, a system, 300 years old, still operating. If this video gave you a new lens for looking at the Epstein story, if it connected dots you hadn't connected before, please share it, because this is the kind of history that gets buried. And the way to keep it from staying buried is to keep talking about it. Drop a comment below. I want to know what part of this history surprised you the most. Was it the colonial era, the legal gray zone, the financial institutions? Tell me below. If you want to go even deeper, if you want to talk through how this connects to your own understanding of power structures, hidden systems, and what's really going on in the world, I do one-on-one counseling and planning sessions. The link is in my bio and the description below. We work through this stuff together in a private space, and we will build real perspective, not just rabbit holes, but actual frameworks for understanding. Subscribe if you're new, hit the notification bell. I post new investigations regularly, and I don't repeat what everyone else is saying. I go deeper.